Michael Brooks, thank you for joining me. Michael Brooks is the host of the Michael Brooks Show and the co-host of the Majority Report, and also Woke Bros, which I really need to listen to because I love it whenever you have Waz on.
Definitely.
So, Michael, I just want to say, like, there's a lot of things I really like about your show, and there's like the obvious things like the international coverage, the leftist perspective, the great guests, the sense of humor. But one of the things I really like is really like the way you operate, and what I mean by that is you're very good at being critical without being polemical, and to me that is just so important. And I wonder. Since this is very much a channel about leftist spirituality and a lot of the time, and you have a background and you do a lot of meditation is a big part of your life. Does that play any part of it, or is it just kind of like your political analysis or media savvy?
Well, it's funny. I think I know what you're pointing to, but I know that tons of people would hear that and say like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" And whether or not they like the fact that they consider me polemical, or a ton of people who think that I'm like a jerk. I would say, in my view, I think I do engage in polemics, and I think I do, whether it's satiric or when I'm really going after somebody. I think I definitely engage in that way. If I understand what I think you're pointing to, is there's kind of like, I think it's kind of both, actually. One is having a certain sense of maybe media savvy, and that you do at the end of the day catch more flies with honey. And I think one distinction would be, I try to save that real, so I'll draw a distinction. Generally having a critical approach and comedy and all the rest obviously is just a big part of the show. I think really going after somebody, I really try to reserve for when that's really necessary. And I think that because so much of the conversation now escalates so quickly, and there's so much melodrama, and there's so much kind of incentive to always go to the most inflammatory, polarized place, that might be some of what's sticking out about some of the presentation. I guess an ability to make some distinctions, do a little bit of nuance. And I think also at times, even when I'm going at somebody or we're really dissecting something, there's still a little bit of a smirk with it. It isn't kind of like totally, just purely pissed off or purely upset, right? I think there is a spiritual dimension to it, which I'm starting to get a little bit more comfortable talking about. Cornel West, as he does usually, puts it so well, but he just had that. I caught some of his interview at Rogan, and I was just so happy to see him getting that platform, because it's, whether people like it or not, it's a very important platform. And he just had this real distinction of hating injustice, hating greed, not hating people, recognizing that systems, institutions, and ideologies flow through people, but you don't want to essentialize them to that. And that's a struggle. There's people I absolutely have a lot of hate and contempt for. I'll totally own that. But I think that it's, adopt that kind of perspective, it gives you a much more fully fleshed out view of human beings. And it also gives you a much more self-assessing and critical view, because something else that I talk about from time to time are things like, Mark Fisher's Exiting the Vampire Castle essay, or, some of the just incredibly toxic tendencies inside the left. And some of those are ideological and some of them need a Marxist critique and so on. I think a lot of them actually do have to do with like a spirituality and empathy deficit, and a discernment deficit.
Yeah, or just just plain people not. Oh, I hate to use this phrase, but not psychologically kind of cleaning their room, so to speak. Um, yeah, well, and I guess what I mean is, yeah, no, you can get polemical, and you do kind of go in for the kill sometimes, or at least go in for the attack. But what I like about the way you operate is, there's this saying. Sometimes you hear someone say, I want an advisor that doesn't have two hands, or I want an advisor that only has one hand. Because there's a lot of tendency for people sometimes to say, well, on the one hand, this person is
Right.
this, and on the other hand, and you kind of do that. You'll say, well, like on the one hand, Beto O'Rourke is a horrible presidential candidate. On the other hand, in the context of running against Ted Cruz or someone else, he'd be great. So, and then comes maybe the harsh criticism. It's I'm looking at the tarot cards right now. Tarot card number 6 is the Lovers. It's about diplomacy, but Michael Brooks is kind of like the Chariot, where sometimes you'd have to say no. This is you have to make a call sometimes and say no. This is the action we need to take. This is the decision we need to make in this kind of space right now.
I love that you're looking at tarot cards. That's going to trigger so many people.
Oh yeah, it does trigger so many people. Well, I changed the name of my channel. It used to be Never Speak in Absolutes, and that was my favorite. That was just too long, and
Hey,
people didn't realize it was a Cretan's paradox, and I got all sorts of like reactionary people like, what is that? You're contradicting yourself. But yeah, I was going to ask you about Cornel West on Rogan, and the thing that's interesting about that, I have this desire, and I go like so many things with the IDW, I go back and forth on it. Like, how do we get Rogan to a better place? And sometimes I think, oh man, he's just swallowed that red pill too hard, and it just kind of baffles me, like how he can have Ben Shapiro on and be like, this is a great conversation, and then have Cornel West on and be like, this is a great conversation. Because Ben Shapiro for me is just one of those people who I want to love everybody and accept everyone's humanity, but he makes it really fucking hard.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's a lot of people out here today starting obvious. I mean, look, forget even these disgusting personalities that we encounter on the internet. Look at who's controlling so much of the world today. I mean, this is a Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro world, and even the functionaries, right? Like whether we're talking about Sergio Moro, if I'm sticking with Brazil, the corrupt, disgusting prosecutor who put Lula in jail, or the Lindsey Graham. I mean, could you imagine just a more imploded pseudo-human than him? I think as Joe Rogan, I think the thing with Rogan though is, I see some media performers have a brilliant, trying to think of how to articulate this. Joe Rogan, and I think honestly, and people always accuse me of going easier on Rogan because they think I want to be on Rogan or whatever. And the answer is, first of all, of course I would go on Rogan.
Of course.
Like, the fucking this is, you did not do any like, I secretly have like a Qatari slush fund. Yes, I would go on the most popular internet talk show and make the case for cosmopolitanism and socialism. Yes, I would do that. That's so. I think we can frame the obvious. And the second thing is, I have no problem criticizing him whatsoever, and I have, in fact, I'm both ideologically and also just clearly as a media performer and as a dude. He isn't Dave Rubin. He isn't any of these people. And there's a lot more to unpack about that, but I want to focus on one specific quality that I actually think kind of trips people up. But it's a great quality to have, right? And I don't think it's put upon or dishonest or anything like that. If you watch someone like Dave Rubin, unless you're, in that scene or whatever, he is not he's not somebody who evokes respect in people,
Yeah.
right? There's people who one might disagree with, and it's different people for, different that's mediated through our experience. Uh, but I think Joe Rogan, and certainly for young men, but he has a certain quality of both. I'd like to, um, do some DMT with that guy, and also that it's almost like people want him to approve of them in a weird way,
It's that
unless they really.
it's that parasocial thing, right? Like that, like
Yeah, he's got it, and I think that actually it's skillful to understand that when you understand his appeal as a media personality. But I actually think it's tripped people up in terms of how they think about his platform, because they have turned it into this personal crusade for one guy's ideology. And it's hilarious because it's like, first of all, his ideology is all over the place.
yeah,
And he's got totally has some reactionary tendencies. He's got some pretty enlightened progressive tendencies. And then he's also totally got, like, he is super similar to everybody I've met who's called themselves like an independent or whatever, and is all over the fucking place, and sometimes has some astute instincts about the delusions of both sides of the political equation, but just as often, if not more, has no idea what they're talking about and is actually way more conservative than they realize they are. What I think is people need to look at, the political economy of that platform more. Even the fact that when he had on, Dorsey from Twitter, and there was a huge meltdown in his IDW segment because supposedly he didn't go hard at him enough about, the stuff they're obsessed with, like shadow banning or whatever. So then he needed to do a follow-up and invite that Tim Pool character on, which was embarrassing for everybody and definitely a huge stop to the right wing. But to me, it's like, by that same token, I mean, Joe Rogan and I follow each other on Twitter. I have no interaction with him, but we do follow each other on Twitter. When I saw he had Cornel West on, I responded. I said, awesome. I retweeted it.
yeah. That's how I found out about it.
Yeah, you gotta just feed the appropriate feedback loops.
Yeah,
And I will say, like, I think I think Cornel West is such a clarifier because, the segment of that audience, and I'm not saying he's converting and flipping people to better politics or whatever, but, the people who could be like, well, I don't know, man, but, that guy sure is like a, wonderful human being and a genius. I'm a conservative, blah, 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 blah. There's a little bit of hope. If somebody's doing the Ben Shapiro talking points about him, then okay, the ship has sailed. They just need to be beat, politically and so on. So I think that, that's relate to Rogan more as in some ways like it's, what is he getting incentivized to do? I think that, and I read a profile of him a while ago and I got the sense that obviously he's not upset that this is like a mega success, but he's a little bit more stressed than he'd like to be because in his head, it's just like, hey, I just sit down with somebody, get high, have a 3-hour conversation and make money. But when you're dealing with that scale, he's got his own incentives and feedback loops, which by the way is also a really good point because
we're all in it right now.
Sorry?
We're all in it right now. I mean, if you're
Right.
on YouTube, you're in social media, you're in a media landscape, you're dealing with the metrics and the feedback loops and, the whole thing, the parasocial relationships and everything. Yeah. That's crazy. Have you ever smoked DMT?
Yeah, no, Have I ever smoked DMT? I have not done DMT. No.
That was just my obligatory Rogan. The
All
delivery
right.
was not
Well,
as good as I hoped because we had a poor
no,
connection just
you would
now.
have been like, no, because I mean, it's all like relationships, and we're all in them. Have you ever like fucking hunted a moose?
It's on my list. I'm up in Poughkeepsie, man. I have a lot of people hunt up here, man. Oh.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Um. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to ask you is somewhat related. Like, so I've kind of started out making videos about Jordan Peterson and the IDW, but that's really not what I want to do. I think there's more important things, and I feel like one of my frustrations, or one of the things I feel that it's hard not to deal with if you're in this left media sphere, is the way the algorithm works. It really promotes conflict and stuff like that. And so you've talked a good deal about the IDW, and you have a book coming out soon. And I'm curious your thoughts on this, because I really go back and forth myself. Like, to what degree is talking about the IDW, to what degree is it kind of a means to, jump in that conversation and steal those people away? And to what degree is it like an ends to itself, because these people are genuinely pretty toxic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I mean, certainly to do a book, and I'm trying to prepare people for this book that, you know, there's definitely 3 chapters that deal with very substantive and systemic critiques of a variety of these characters, and in particular, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. But the frame and the wraparound of the book is an argument for a kind of global humanist socialist perspective.
Mm.
And I think that the part about dealing with them, because they promote a lot of toxic ideas and a lot of you know uh, bad things, and they exploit a lot of weaknesses in the liberal media landscape. That is important, and I think there is, that there's the function of just doing segments in the same way that, when I came up, and still do a little bit more of this on Majority Report, although we do it also actually on TMBS too. There is that sort of critical ombudsman kind of like function, right? Like, you take a Fox News clip, you take a whatever, and you expose the problems. I think the broader thing, though, is that, yeah, you have to use it as a launching point to present much more compelling and dynamic ideas, partial and a strategic sense of how things actually work in the real world. Partially because the ideas and all of these types of right-wing ideologies have a superficial appeal for a certain kind of person,
Yeah.
and also because, as I say, there's a there's a lot of weaknesses inside conventional liberal discourse that allows these guys to inflate fake controversies, take actual legitimate criticisms, and then inflate them or distort them. I mean, you know, again, watching Cornel West, what's so incredible is that it's all there. I mean, he's historicizing. He's giving you a material and historical, ethical, and cultural analysis. He's explaining the economics of cultural appropriation, and then also rejecting the just, pure bifurcation of like some of the more absurd forms of that kind of argument that you'll see particularly on campuses and online. He's explaining how you can have militant struggle and also understand universal humanity, that white supremacy foundational to this country, but also historically and economically contingent. And, I'm not saying that we all just need to, there's a lot of different people that have a lot of different spins on things, and we're all learning and fusing together. For me, it's Cornel West, Amartya Sen, Cabral, Bill Fletcher Jr., Adolph Reed, Richard Wolff, Fatima Mernissi, and also peers. Joy Gray's influenced me. Malika Jabali's influenced me. All of my, everybody I have on the show, Anna Kasparian, Emma Vigeland, all of these people seriously influenced me. And then the kind of like foundational mentors intellectually that I mentioned before, Milton Alamati. But that kind of broad framework that he knocked out there in those couple of hours that dilutes so much of the poison of whatever we're calling, the sort of, I would say, categories focused epistemic closure liberal politics, and then on the other hand infusing the materialist analysis with a spiritual, cultural, emotional, and textual richness, so that doesn't become its own one note, at times one-dimensional ideology. Now, my book is different. It's doing different things, and it's making a particular kind of argument, but it's absolutely in that vein. And I think that that's when you really get to. I loved there's this idea of pre and post critique that I got actually from Ken Wilber, who's another pretty. I have a lot of problems with him, but this is a great frame. So, when you read someone like, when you listen to a conversation with Sam Harris or somebody, and they're bitching about college students and people who are, care about racism or sexism or whatever, that's a pre-critique. Because these people they don't have any historical awareness. They don't have any empathy. They are, almost, probably totally unconsciously, they're constantly promoting racism and bigotry. They can claim to be staunchly opposed to bigotry, even as they try to forward, discredited, Victorian cranium science type of things. This is totally toxic stuff. Then we go to the culture they're talking about, and then we see that, okay, right. These accusations are hurled in every context at certain times, even in ways that at times can just be, like, again, we see it like in the most absurdity, like in presidential elections against, Bernie's anti-women, or, some other nonsense like that has no grounding in reality. So we can see that the toxic manifestations of it, we can see the toxic manifestations of it in certain, movements and ideas that are actually really important, but can be, manifested in incredibly toxic and narrowing ways that harm people, that create vampire castles, that undermine solidarity. And so the post critique is, you are absolutely not denying, as an example, the foundational reality that I say that there's a white supremacist country. And then you're also weaving in, there's economics, there's spirituality, there's different dynamics and different situations. This is a really petty example, and I won't talk about it one way or another, to be honest, because it's just not important. But it's exactly the type of thing that they get mileage on. I saw a Tucker segment, and there was a thing in Georgia where basically a Georgia state lawmaker said that a guy at a checkout line said something, told her to go back to her country. And to make a long story short, it turns out he didn't say that. And now, though, her lawyer is trying to sue him for making her feel unsafe. I mean, it was one of those examples from everything that's publicly available of like, wow, this is just, this is that just utterly ludicrous thing that people talk about. But that is both something that, when we answer the right, can say, oh, okay, you love to talk about these petty, trivial examples of, toxic woke culture, whatever you want to talk about. I want to talk about wealth inequality, policing, democracy, voting, civil rights, culture, humanity, the 90% of our lives are shaped by this collectively that you either want to ignore or actively contribute to the negative side of. But then on the flip side, you tell, people that are quote unquote on your side to clean this shit up because it's toxic, it's ineffective, and it's harnessed by the right. And I think that the IDW can give an opportunity to do so much of that kind of work, to debunk all of the racism, debunk all of the capitalist and scientism and all of that and all the sexism and everything else, not to just go to the other position of, oh, you guys are this and that and blah, 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 but to really explain what superficially looks like a sophisticated critique is nothing more than window dressed right-wing nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, that's right on. Well, so since I moved up here, like some of like the few like groups of like people I hang out with, one of them is my martial arts instructor, and he's just like a total reactionary, as is very common amongst people in martial arts. And he'll talk about SJW type of stuff if we're out for a drink or something. And I always like kind of, just in a very good martial arts type of way, just kind of pivot it to like, well, yeah, those people are crazy, and but what about wealth inequality? What about all these other things? And just kind of like flip, because those things I think are more accessible to more people. But yeah,
Yeah, I think they are accessible, and I think that it's also though like very, again, it's such an interesting dialectic because it's like flipping things to things that are more accessible. Absolutely. I mean, that's just the smartest thing to do.
Yeah.
And then there's also recognizing like, this is to me, another thing in the sort of left culture that's very difficult. I was actually talking with Joshua Kahn about this, who's on my show a lot, who's a very close friend of mine who does work in actual organizing and direct action spaces. And in some ways he was kind of saying like the problem is that a lot of this woke culture stuff starts in very specific contexts. You could almost compare it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Take comparisons.
It's like can I make a comparison? It's to me it's like the way I think of it is taking something that exists in a certain ecosystem and trying to move it and seeing how the rest of that ecosystem you put it in responds. And it's not good.
Well, right, absolutely. That's definitely part of it. But it's also that, like, some people might be ready to and want to do, like, the advanced practices of the real subtle psychological, spiritual, political, interpersonal work of, like, dismantling certain belief systems, right, that are ingrained about, say, race as an example. And that could take place, and I do think that, that type of work can take place in very specific, intensive contexts, and it has some value. And then it sort of gets translated where, certainly on Twitter and certainly in much of activism and social media and campuses, you're not actually doing that work. You're just learning languages and performances of how to convey that you quote unquote get it. And then when you really amplify it to actual large scale politics, and this is where I just make such a hard and fast distinction, which is like, look, if somebody came to me, and I have a concrete example of this, the Danish Socialist Party, they rebounded in the last election cycle because they adopted a hard right xenophobic position on asylum seekers. It's a position that is anti-humanity. It absolutely plays the nativist and racist sentiment. And it might be electorally very winning to say, I'll increase social services, protect social democracy, and be a bigot, right? That might be very shrewd. The part where I say, look, this is where we have hard and fast ethics, when it, like the concentration camps at the border, these types of things. this is the part of the conversation to me about racism and xenophobia and so on.
Oh no, you're cutting out.
That's not negotiable. That's just a basic. Am I here? You got me?
No, you're back. You're back.
Hello.
You're back.
So
Oh,
that part is non-negotiable. That is basic humanity choice. And what's interesting to me is that those issues have very little to do, by the way, with the sort of performativity of online manner policing and all this type of thing. That is, you could use a language that was developed by, A. Philip Randolph in the 1940s. This is clear stuff. This is humanity. This is democracy. This is anti-racism. And those are all non-negotiable things. So, and then on the flip side, if somebody votes the right way, wants to dismantle ICE and will organize in a labor union across every sexual and racial boundary, then I don't care what kind of comedy they listen to. I don't care what their social life is. I don't care, how they use their language. I don't care what their, rituals are. Maybe they're religious. Maybe they want to live a hyper conventional life. Maybe they actually genuinely in their own personal view have different ideas about dating or what, or even like even more extreme, like maybe they don't have particularly personally enlightened views about like their own desire to be like in a diverse context. You could throw all those things in, and to be honest, like, look, I wish it was different from my own normative perspective. But from the perspective of politics and organizing, that stuff is irrelevant. I need people to vote the right way, organize the right way, and act the right way in a civic space. And all this other stuff about controlling what people think, controlling, people's different cultural patterns and behaviors and all this stuff, let go of it. Because also, and the other weird thing is a lot of it starts to become like, I don't think this is really your concern.
well, and how do you even
try to police everybody's way of being?
Yeah, how do you even do that? How do you legislate?
Yeah.
It's not politics. It's
Right.
performance. Yeah. So one of the things that you brought up when talking about Cornel West, which when I was listening to that interview, at any time I listen to Cornel West, I'm not only I not only do I want to start calling everyone brother and sister and realize I probably couldn't get away with it. Even though it's a really positive affectation. But like you were saying, like he draws on so much. He draws on philosophy and history and literature and music, and he pulls it all in. And at times, and when I'm trying to, do my thing and thinking, am I pulling too much shit in here? Why do I have, music and all these music and the tarot and leftist politics and environment? Why am I trying? And then I see him and I'm like, no, I'm doing it right. But my question actually that I wanted to circle around to is, in covering, like, you kind of answered like my questions about the IDW that I were going to ask in the course of just talking right now. But one question I wanted to ask, and you've talked a little bit about this, but is like leftist mystical alternatives. And for me, like you mentioned Ken Wilber, and like people mention like Alan Watts, and I know you're big on Ram Dass, and I've made some videos comparing Jordan Peterson to Terence McKenna.
Huh.
Well, because in a way, I think they fill a similar type of space. Like they both appeal to like kind of a gap or a failing in like higher academic education, and they both they both have like crazy, like Peterson's got his maps of meaning, Terence McKenna had his like weird time wave thing, but of course, like Terence McKenna was obviously way cooler, for all his just like brain fried like insanity. He was actually very much, he didn't have the most developed politics, but he, was very much spoke out against like what he saw as like dominator culture or whatever, whereas Peterson is just all about hierarchy. And I just think about like the 10-year, like, you know, when I first started looking at YouTube 10 years ago, more, you know, like it was Terrence McKenna videos all over, and you know, a few years ago it was Jordan Peterson. And just to think like of just the difference, and like, are there any like leftist, like in a mystical tradition that you think about that are like a good antidote to that? And have you thought about that comparison actually? Because I brought it up to Doug Lane, and he was pretty it sparked his interest. I remember.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. I got to cop to the fact that I am not that knowledgeable on Terrence McKenna. He kind of,
He's wacky. I mean, he's
it's not, it's, I mean, his stylistically it doesn't draw me as much. And what also happened though is that I was very, I would say, kind of high school age through college. There was a lot. My first trajectory into this stuff, although I did experience psychedelics, probably, frankly, way too young to be honest.
yeah.
I was on a real Buddhist and Hindu track. So for a very long time, and I read widely. I read about Greek mysticism and Russian, and I certainly read about Islam because I also already had that interest also in the political dimensions. Then and even to this, and even now, like I'm sort of reconnecting with this, or even speaking publicly about it from the perspective that I do find most of quote unquote spiritual culture and thinking to just be totally insipid.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, just honestly, the worst of all, just not interesting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I missed a lot. McKenna never, I've had a lot of friends that have been into McKenna, but McKenna never really he slipped through the cracks of my education spiritually. But in terms of the kind of broader things, the anecdote specifically to Jordan Peterson, to me, in a way, is James Hillman.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so fucking terrifying to me, actually, because I do think it does speak honestly to how I mean, I make a lot of jokes about it, but honestly, the fact that Jordan Peterson can throw so much what I would consider to be reactionary gender politics and defenses of, conflating the idea, right? Like, yes, you said he's really into hierarchy, and the idea that he can talk like, be so dim-witted, frankly, as to compare like, well, fucking, Golden State are better than the fucking Nets, and that's a hierarchy. With the fact that we, have such, I mean, if you were just doing linear comparisons to the animal kingdom or whatever, or lobsters, there's no equivalent to the amount of wealth holding disparity that you have in modern capitalist societies. I mean, it's a delusional, offensive,
it's
ridiculous comparisons. And also then the fact that if we were to take, his behavior and his crying and his carrying on is like a sexist depiction of a woman in a 50s movie. I mean, he's hysterical. He's always freaking out. Everything's a big melodrama. Everything is a big problem. It's insane. And what's so fascinating and disturbing to me, when I read James Hillman, and I'll say for people who don't know James Hillman, he was a Jungian, but he created his own school called archetypal psychology. He died a couple years ago. He had actually, I think he did have a period in the 90s where he had New York Times bestsellers, and I might have even gotten on Oprah. But he was somebody who, and then on the flip side, very much a guy who took the world of dreams and spirit and stuff extremely seriously. So he would make, my comrades very uncomfortable in that regard. But what was so incredible was like, first of all, his politics were actually pretty good. And by the 1990s, he's already writing these brilliant tracts about how like a lot of things like depression and anxiety are because we live in a profoundly dysfunctional, might ameliorate it, but it will never solve those problems because they are objective problems. You're supposed to be upset sitting in traffic all day. Homelessness surrounding you is supposed to depress you because it's bad and wrong and a dysfunctional system. And he actually quite elegantly explained the interplay between your psychological reality and those social problems, which, Peterson wants to draw a barrier around. Now, again, his argument's ridiculous. Of course, there are parts of the U.S. left in particular that are, clearly in need of room cleaning, to say the least.
Yeah.
But Hillman definitely enlarged that scope. And then the other part, and this is funny, honestly, just as a role model, like if James Hillman was talking to confused young men, what's so bizarre to me is that they would be getting an anti-capitalist reality-based message about politics. They would also be getting a maybe at times romantic and essentialist, which could be a problem in his thinking, but certainly a guy who's cosmopolitan and global and not doing this West chauvinist bullshit. And then thirdly, and most deeply ironically, by his bearing, his maturity, his elder statesmanship would be conveying so much more of a powerful model, frankly, for being a man, straightening your back, and all the other stuff that Jordan Peterson puts inside all of its shadow of sexism and patriarchy and reactionary politics, and then also completely does not model himself as a crying, raving hysteric.
Yes. Well, that's really it on the head. He's like the reverse of the emperor card. He's that father figure who doesn't follow his own rules. And I have to say, at first I kind of was like very critical of Peterson, and I said, well, you know what? I don't like him, but at least he's sincere. At least he's sincere. And now, after his just repeated like dodgings of attempts to interview for people to engage in debates with him, I'm like, okay, well, I guess he's not even sincere.
No, the way he handled
Richard Wolff.
Richard Wolff, disgusting. By the way, Richard Wolff's another great example. Richard Wolff, to me, Richard Wolff doesn't talk in these lanes as much, but what a model. What presence, you know what I mean? Like, for people looking for that kind of leadership, that kind of presence. But yeah, and then I have to say, I thought Peterson was actually as likable as he's gonna be in the debate with Zizek.
Yeah.
But setting everything else aside, and people had a lot of bad takes going into it. It ended up being a good debate. Zizek did a great job. To the extent any of this stuff matters, it was a gain to the left. And actually, there was some very smart critiques of the white middle class bougie wokeism. All of that, it was very good. And that being said, and trying to be as charitable as possible, but it's like you have been running around the primarily, I guess, the United States, Europe, and Canada, ranting and raving, warmed over John Birch shit. You finally agree to a debate, and you've read the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah, exactly.
Honestly, that's fucking embarrassing.
As these bloody neo-Marxists that have invaded the campuses and that are in the process of invading the rest of the culture as fast as they can possibly manage it. I'm not their friends, not in the least.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest.
Have you ever heard of a thing called fluoridation? Fluoridation of water? Do you realize that fluoridation is the most monstrously conceived and dangerous communist plot we have ever had to face?
And OISI, for example, in Ontario, is perhaps, apart from the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the most dangerous institution in Canada.
Foreign substances introduced into our precious bodily fluids without the knowledge of the individual, certainly without any choice. That's the way a hardcore commie works.
They don't believe in the individual. The paramount importance of the individual. And
That's the way a hardcore commie works.
they don't believe that there's any such thing as competence. They don't believe that there's any such thing as up.
On no account will a commie ever drink water, and not without good reason.
You realize that in addition to fluoridating water, where there are studies underway to fluoridate salt, flour, fruit juices, soup, sugar, milk, ice cream, Mandrake, children's ice cream. Good.
They're interested in the indoctrination of people as young as they can get their hands on.
Communist infiltration, communist indoctrination.
Jack, listen, tell me, Jack, when did you first develop this theory?
Well, I first became aware of it, Mandrake, during the physical act of love.
Huh.
Yes, a profound sense of fatigue, a feeling of emptiness followed. Luckily, I was able to interpret these feelings correctly. Loss of essence.
Huh.
I can assure you it has not recurred, Mandrake. Women sense my power, and they seek the life essence. I do not avoid women, Mandrake.
Yeah.
But I do deny them my essence.
Yes.
Like that's, I mean, again, it's so because people jumped, and I even agreed that, like, from a debate perspective, I'm glad that Zizek didn't, get into like, well, can you explain to me what you think surplus value is? Like,
Yeah.
I'm glad he didn't do that. I'm glad he didn't do that. He did it perfectly. And credit, I guess, to Peterson for, kind of being open. But it was like, but setting all of that aside, what a delusional, lazy, pathetic. I mean, it was very much like, last year he was getting interviewed by some guy from Australia, and the guy was asking about the Baker case, and Peterson's like, well, the Baker should be able to do what it wants. And the guy was like, well, that's what restaurants said about the civil rights movement. And again, Peterson, maybe you're right and I'm wrong. And everybody's like, oh, look at how humble he is. And like, yeah, maybe a guy who's going to frame himself as the most important intellectual in the world today should, be able to do, I mean, that is bare minimum stuff. So yes, doesn't follow his own advice, has this total sloppy superficialness combined with a total reactionary hysteria, which ironically is also clearly only, it's generated by his own psychological issues and reaction. That's also what's so funny about it.
Well, and the other thing about him is he's a Jungian who doesn't realize how much he's projecting.
Right.
Like it's just kind of mind-boggling. He really is something in that regard. But okay, let's just shift gears real quickly. Because I wanted to ask you about something that you talked about a few weeks ago on your show, and is like really kind of like one of the lanes I'm in. And it might even connect to the IDW somewhat, because whenever I talk about energy, you always encounter these people who seem a lot like Sam Harris fans who are going to tell you about nuclear and thorium And you know, if Sam Harris says like the history is irrelevant, these people are, you know, saying that the ecology and the economy is irrelevant because I understand, you know, the way certain isotopes, you know, work and degrade and whatnot. But I feel like this is a topic that is really important, but it's really hard to talk about for a lot of reasons. Mostly because, you know, in order to be able to talk about, you know, a sustainable energy transition, you need to be able to talk about a couple of different scientific disciplines. You need to, you know the economics, the sociology, the ecology, the politics, and how they all interact. And it's nobody can do that, you know. So you end up with a lot of cranks, but you also end up with, you know, people who are more informed, who maybe don't see the whole picture and are kind of arguing past each other. And I don't know, the two kind of tendencies or tensions I see that I think make it difficult to talk about this stuff are, you know, the fully automated luxury communism on the one end, and then kind of the recognition that, like, yeah, that would be nice, but some things are scarce, and, you know, there's not a possibility for, you know, like, and again, like, there's so many tensions and contradictions here. Like, you know, the U.S. is 5% of the population, but we use, like, I don't know, a third of the energy, a quarter of the resources. But, you know, those are only a couple of companies, but we use the products that they produce. But, you know, we really need to change the system because, you know, just trying to focus on personal consumption is so tough. But we also need to recognize that in order to do that, then, you know, we're going to have to get used to some changes, and the changes might be better. And where I kind of end up, and as far as I can tell, I don't think that renewables can power an industrial, capitalist, you know, consumer society. I think they could power a, like, eco-socialist society where we've decommodified as much as possible so people don't need to overproduce as happens. Because I feel, you know, fossil fuels and capitalism have really come up together. You know, the steam engine and, you know, workers slaving away in mines. It all, and so I don't know. Like, I guess I'm curious. I guess to actually make this a question, like, how do you deal with, like, trying to cover that? Because it is something that there's no consensus on, and it is so tricky. You need to have so much. You need to have so much information in order to be able to just get a grasp on it.
I mean, you know, I try to, and I will own that a lot of people who talk about it and ask about it, there's certain tendencies around certain subjects where it brings out, they're annoying. I'll put it that way. And I'm sure that they think that I'm, you know, being a Luddite, whatever. So I'm sure it goes both ways. But I mean, I'll get to your wrong points.
Hey, you just broke
up. But when
it
comes to the nuclear power,
you just broke up.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what's going on. I'm still breaking up. I haven't moved or anything.
You're good. You're good now. You're good now. You're good now. All right, cool.
Sorry about that. I literally am in exactly the same place.
No problem.
When it comes to, you know, nuclear power, one, I don't like to talk about it because I still cannot pronounce that fucking word. But and I feel like some people perceive this as a cop-out, but to me it is really not, right? Like, I'll add one other area that people freak out about with me, and that is GMOs.
Uh-huh.
And I'll actually just say, too, with GMOs that I'm sorry, but I have, frankly, enough questions around the companies behind these products and how they've conducted themselves that I, frankly, don't just trust that they're safe for that they're not potentially not good for your health either, right? And that really triggers people. It's not the main part of my argument at all.
Yeah.
And they could be safe for people, right? I want to just also flag that I'm not in the, like, I think people have very much overcorrected against, you know, they really took Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart's response to Bush as the sort of like, and then the kind of new atheist thing popped up, and that there's this very blind, one-dimensional worship of science, which, you know, I joke around about this stuff, but the counteraction to that is not rejecting quote unquote science, but it's to get a hell of a lot more critical about science as a political process. And again, that doesn't mean, you know, freshman year, oh, I decided that, you know, evolution is powered by goblins and I can just believe that. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you don't understand that what gets researched and how it gets researched is so massively influenced by industry and by incentive structures, then you're just not in the real world. And so my thing with nukes and with GMOs really comes down to the fact that, you know, I'll just say GMOs briefly. GMOs, the primary problem with GMOs is that they are proprietary technologies owned by small sections of agri-conglomerates. That poses a structural threat to the democracy of the food supply, the well-being of farmers, right? And that is a political and economic question separate from a quote-unquote health question. When it comes to nukes, it's like, do I trust the Trump administration, to put a really crude point on it, to approve an expansion of those power facilities, and that private companies in the nuclear power space are going to be any more responsible and, you know, responsible and safe than any other under-regulated and easily corruptible, you know, industry? No, I don't. So when I get questions about these technologies and you blow by it saying that these things are safe because X, Y, and Z, it's like, first of all, okay, but sorry, we don't really know that. In the nuke case, that is actually, and I have all sorts of problems with him, but I like Nassim Taleb's turkey example, right? Which is like every day a turkey wakes up, it gets fed. You know, I guess it's not an agri-turkey. I guess it's a turkey at like a nice little organic farm. Gets fed, walks around, eats, it's in the sun, and it has every single expectation that every other day will be like that until it gets its head chopped off. So nuclear power, it's like, yeah, that's great until it's not.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, and also like, this is also on top of the fact that we don't even have a storage strategy. Like, we have discarded fuel rods that are a threat now to public health.
Yeah.
So you cannot, you know, people want a one-trick techno bullet that doesn't exist. And then it's like, well, we can't wait till we deal with capitalism and the broader structural issues. We need to do something now. I agree. However, I would certainly say that to do something as radically dangerous as nuclear power would be the type of thing that I would want to implement after you've had serious structural political reforms. Because if you trust that kind of expansion of energy in this political environment, in this world system, I think you're being very naive.
Yeah. Well, and on both GMOs and nuclear, the interesting thing about it is I never start with the safety argument. I always start with the GMOs don't produce higher yields. You know, they're primarily things that you want to spray with more pesticides. They're not working to, for example, save bananas from fungus, which is going to be a real problem. And then, you know, nuclear power, they're not, it's ghastly expensive in, you know, if, you know, even if you were just printing money, like in, you know, actual material terms, it's ridiculously logistically crazy. And then there's the externalities of, you know, we don't even have anything that is close to as old as how long it would need to be stored. It's mind-boggling, and
that's the bottom line. I actually love what you said about GMOs. No, that's the big. I think there's a really serious problem with the idea of seed patents and the idea of turning food from a commons into a it already is a private commodity, but getting into the actual gene structure, seed structure of foods, that's, if people can't see how dangerous that is, then I don't know. You need to do a huge amount of remedial reading.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you're absolutely right. It hasn't achieved, that if you want to, I'll be willing maybe to concede, okay, sure, I guess it's safe for people to eat. I don't think we really know that, but maybe it is. But then you have to concede that all of the stuff that GMOs were promised to do when I first started reading about GMOs back in the day, solve hunger, beat, all sorts of crop problems, hasn't achieved any of that. And in fact, the first one they went to market with the big one, Roundup Ready, which they said would require less pesticides because it had an internal pesticide release. The research showed that it ended up you used actually more pesticides on it than in comparable crops. So, I'm interested in the psychology behind people's need to have savior technologies.
Yeah. Well,
and it's like, whether it's Elon Musk or a brilliant new nuke, I'm sorry, guys. I mean, honestly, I don't take pleasure in that. If I really thought there was some just easy little thing that could happen, and it was like we could just get some guys with, lab coats in a room, that would be great. I mean, then I would fucking, I don't know, I would be like trying to write an Eddie Murphy movie, or, like star in my own sitcom, like, okay, but that's just not how it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so it's interesting you say that, because the one conservative who I can't listen to him anymore, but for a while he was really good, because he's kind of a weirdo. He's like in the peak oil, like, that whole sphere, I would say. But he talked about this guy, John Michael Greer, whose politics have kind of really surfaced since Trump got into office. And
what's his name?
John Michael Greer.
Okay. Got it.
Worth listening to on ecology. I mean, he thinks we're headed for a slow collapse. Rome did not fall in a day type of thing, which, who knows, if we don't get our act together, we very well could be. But his politics are very reactionary, I would say, and it's become. But his views on ecology and to some extent spirituality are interesting. Even though he's a little bit, like I said, reactionary. But his whole thing is like, yeah, we want that silver bullet because we don't want to change our way of life. We want to keep on, going with what is comfortable. With the ridiculous amounts of energy that we've become very used to using, and I think there's something to that. I think we could probably have a pretty happy life without it, but it's how do you get here from there? I need to get to work. I need to drive my car to work. I would love to be able to take the train and not have to drive my car, but I need to drive my car because also my employer wants me to get there in the snow, so I need to have four-wheel drive. So I need to have the SUV. It's like, how do you take care of that? And
yeah, but I think that's such a great. I think that's actually sort of, to me, in some ways, the point, right? Like, I'm not a luxury space communism guy either. Although I do think that there's definitely going to need to be, that's part of the equation, right? There is going to need to be rapid deployments of renewables, innovation. All of that stuff is definitely a part of an integral picture. And I think, ironically, I mean, that is in some ways, if you look at what China's doing and certain parts of the European Union, that is actually an area where, I mean, obviously not pure capitalism, because that doesn't, right? That doesn't exist. There's government regulation, government incentives, and then inside the context created by government, there's market forces that are actually rapidly deploying these things. So I think that's actually an area where there's some trajectory to that. Then I think there could be, I think not in terms of, lessening people. I want to enhance people's living standards, obviously, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in a different, in a different environment. I mean, God,
Less energy, less consumption, better
less
life.
consumption, better life. People are choosing there. I think we can't discount some of that dimension of just like living lighter on the earth at all. And then I think the third thing that I would add though is there is also the like, less sexy, less exciting, and not perfect, but would make a massive difference, part of, yes, if all of the United States became train accessible,
Yeah.
that would be a massive fucking difference.
Yeah.
I mean, if people, I mean, there's a huge, I mean, even suburbs could have some interventions in them to be made, more dense, more walkable. So I'm also of the school that let's also, I'm not saying it will be sufficient, but there's a massive amount of low hanging fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, there really is. There really is. There really is. Okay, so I think we've been talking for about a little over an hour now. I got two more questions I want to ask you.
Go for it.
So the first one is, I wasn't sure if I was going to ask you this because it's kind of out there, but I think it's somewhat relevant to what we're talking to. In some Marxist traditions, in some Marxist interpretations, I don't know if they're the right or the wrong ones. I haven't read enough Marx and enough Marxists, but there is a sense of teleology. The sense that we're going to get there eventually. And I'm thinking about that in terms of energy. What is your take on that? I mean, for me, let's do the work and not worry about it to some extent. But but also from a spiritual point of view, are you familiar with Marianne Williamson when she was on Chapo? She brought up Teilhard de Chardin, who I don't know, kind of had this vision. I got a hint of when you were talking about before of just the kind of changes we need to make, the kind of we need to go where, what the hell is going on all of a sudden, which is why I can't really buy into a John Michael Greer just kind of cyclical vision of history where it's just one empire rising and falling after another, because I see us getting stitched together in this global information network and that creating new things that come out of it. And I have no idea what I was trying to ask you there.
Well, I think that you have to, Marxism is helpful in, analytically in a way of grounding it, right? Because there's so many different ways of looking at that question, right? I think that obviously there's seeing history as a progressive movement towards something, because one, there's obviously the history and not so subtle subtext of, well, as an example, how much of our biodiversity is protected by First Nations people that we still attack and have no regard for every single day. And while, again, the classic kind of dichotomy, I have no interest in romanticizing or making those societies to be perfect. That's obviously not true, but they are also incredibly sound, important, and fully developed societies that don't need to go somewhere else or be something else to be whole, right? So there is that part of it. Then I think, in a Marxist sense, though, it is very, it's, and it might even be outside. I mean, we might need to start really looking at, as an example, First Nations people as having a continuity and change in their own relationships with imperialism, colonialism, and genocide, but maybe not necessarily fitting in some ways into a framework that certainly could be applied to, like, Europe in, since like the 12th century, say, right? Or certainly worlds that have been Europeanized through colonialism and imperialism and so on, or even if you go back, post agricultural revolution societies, right? Or meaning like thousands of years ago, people becoming farmers. So when Marxists talk about, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, a lot of it is correlating with, it's not a moral judgment. I mean, it's literally, there is technological changes and modes of production that radically transform how people live. In some ways, good, in some ways bad, right? I mean, I'm sure there were some people that had, even under feudalism, a nicer dynamic of being in some form of commons and having, on one hand, no self-control and maybe actually a touch of autonomy, versus being in a sweatshop in Manchester, right? So I it's not linear.
Yeah.
I think in the day, I think what Desjardins teaches us, and what that vision teaches us, is we're definitely being stitched together. That is an objective fact. And also, I just want to say, as far as empires go, I mean, one way of understanding, you could understand the process of globalization we've had as a form of empire itself. That's Hart and Negree's argument.
Yeah.
Right? But we are being stitched together. We are in interdependence, and it's being actualized. And then the social and material question is, do we unite across borders in solidarity to create a democracy-driven, workers-oriented society? That's the socialist dimension. And then the spiritual dimension, obviously, is, yes, we do have like a new sphere, like Desjardins talked about, and the new sphere has a huge amount of toxicity in it, because there's a lot of, spiritual disease and everything else. So I think it's true, but I don't, I think it's a dialectic. It is true, and it requires all the work you're talking about, and the recognition of, there's other ways in which, things are cyclical. There's ways in which things have probably gotten worse in certain ways, and then there's ways in which, we're stitching something together, right? I mean, we're stitching something together, and we are the greatest harm and threat to the biosphere that we've ever been in human history, definitionally.
Yeah.
So I think that it's some combination of both. I mean, I've been around some conversations, of people who get really into that, particularly around Ken Wilber, who, is in somewhat of that vein of Desjardins and has some great insights. Unfortunately, his politics, his history, his sociology, and I guess also his kind of conventional science is just like really sloppy and incredibly underread and embarrassing. And he has got some, it's just some kind of like baked over 70s, 80s New Age stuff, which is just, it's done culturally and still kind of being carried. But his quadrant model is brilliant. He's got some development can be fascinating, has an insight. But like, I've been in rooms where, people are definitely using, consciousness is evolving, we're changing, we're going into the integral age, whatever.
Yeah.
Based just because, they don't want to deal with reality that's in front of them.
Yeah.
And that's a magical belief system to not deal with what's going on. And then, again, there's other people who deny that there is something beautiful and spectacular about the fact that, like, look, my show's, for what it is, it has success and some profile, but it's grassroots. It's the fact that I can have a community that's peer-to-peer with people who support it and buy it and so on, and that it's a fusion of entertainment, politics, business, but maybe even social movement building and the community and friendship. And then that also can translate to playing some not huge, but a role in solidarity with, as an example, Lula in Brazil, I just recorded a 35-minute interview with the former Brazilian foreign minister. And it's like, of course he should come on platforms like mine. A lot of people that he should be reaching are watching and listening. But it's a completely different, this isn't even 7 years ago where it might be, well, it needs to be mediated through television or whatever else. I mean, that is a positive development.
So do you know where the origin of the word broadcasting?
No, tell me.
It's I was reading a gardening book last year and I found it out. So when you plant, when you space out and plant a seed in an individual spot and you do it like that, I don't even know what it's called. I don't even know if there's a name for it. But broadcasting is when you take like a handful of seeds and just kind of toss it out and just kind of hope it hits like everything. It's like not this. And so it just struck me because we're not broadcasting anymore. Like the broadcasting is slowly morphing into something else. It's slowly morphing into something smaller broadcasting and more peer-to-peer. And it's, the future's going to look less like a television broadcast and more like a Slack or a Discord. It's going to be more actual, maybe more meaningful connections. But I get that when I tune into you. You're you probably are to my kids what like Dan Rather was to me.
That's hilarious.
Like they probably see you. It's like talking, like doing the news, and the only difference is I don't think Dan Rather did any good impersonations of silly media figures.
Well, I hope they're not learning a lot of curse words from me.
No. Probably not. They have their own set of.
They got their own sources.
Yeah, they got their own sources. Okay, so just one more question before I go, and this isn't even a question for you. I wanted to know if you have any read on who Nation of Islam Obama is going to endorse as a presidential candidate. I mean, maybe Biden, but I don't know. I don't know if he's going to go for a candidate of color or what. I don't know. Do you have any read on that?
Donald Trump. Let's finish what we started. I want this whole thing to be done. Yeah. Marry yourselves to death, devils. I was thinking, Nation of Islam Obama is obviously going to continue, but I think the new one, because they lied, they distorted this clip of Ilhan Omar saying like, profile white man or whatever, which is very misleading. But I was thinking like, the new one could be Ilhan Omar, like I, Ilhan Omar, call for a total and complete shutdown of all new Red Lobsters until we figure out what the hell is going on. We need to put ankle bracelets on white people because a lot of bad things are happening. These are bad guys. They sit around, they eat Miracle Whip and write stupid things in the chat rooms and shoot up Pilates studios. And I'm sure some of them are nice people. But we have a big problem.
Oh, Ilhan Omar Trump. I love it. Well,
that's definitely the new one.
Oh,
yes.
Man. Well, I got to tell you, I really enjoyed, and it can only, it could only have lasted so long, but I really liked the Andrew Yang. I like the Andrew Yang.
The Andrew Yang has to come in. By the way, his people are so fucking annoying. They should be locked in detention centers and listen to my impression of him all day. Jesus, those are annoying.
Yeah.
What was Andrew Yang was the robot thing? Just
the constant like, well, they're going to be fucking your wives, and
yeah, just like, they already are pretty upset that they're having reduced work hours, but did some calculations by the year 2035, that robot's going to have your truck driving job. By the year 2041, he's going to be actually going down on your wife. And, a lot of white working class guys, they actually don't like the idea of a robot licking their wives' vaginas. So
This is something that in the freedom dividend will actually. You do that in. I love it's like there's an actual critique that none of them want to hear that they need to hear, and then they hear that impression, which is just stupid, right? Like it's just the same way that I do Bernie calling to put people in gulags and have a cultural revolution, and they get upset by that fucking impression. They're the most humorless pests.
Well,
I mean, obviously Tulsi's people are super annoying too, but that I think is a lot of, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff out there, is all I'll say.
Virgil Texas did a good job, just like taking him to task in this interview in a nice way.
He took Yang to task.
In a very nice way.
I hope so.
Well, he grilled him on, he grilled him every which way on the, on the VAT tax and all those types of things. But
what else have a VAT tax? Whether you're
well, okay, so it's funny. So
all of a sudden a robot is actually there and he's giving your daughter methamphetamines and then also having sex with your wife. So this is actually the future of automation, when your robot is your dealer and he's cucking you with your wife. That's when we have a really big problem from the perspective of a truck driver in the Midwest, and then they might want to become a skinhead.
So I got to tell you, this is actually, believe it or not, a topic that I'm like starting to write about a little bit right now, because all right. So the whole right-wing obsession with the word cuck is kind of fascinating to me, because I'm an English major, and I think the only place I heard that up until, a few years ago was like, in like Shakespeare or whatever. And all of a sudden it's like everywhere. And on the one hand, like I like calling Ben Shapiro and these like goons cucks, but on the other hand, like I don't think it's fair to cucks. Like none of them, or even the most pathetic amongst them, are not anywhere, near as vile as Ben Shapiro. But like just kind of the there's obvious like racial insecurities, but that's like,
that's what it is, right?
Like, but that's like just scratching the surface. Like, I'm actually gonna try and write a piece where it's like sex at dawn meets the reactionary mind meets women have better sex under socialism type of thing, because there's just a lot.
That's a good idea.
There's a lot of anxieties there.
Yes.
And so instead saying that they have anxieties because they're not well endowed, what we could do is have a second dividend for sex robots, so that by the year 2051, a guy who's a truck driver could also have a girlfriend.
Yeah, that's the thing. I will go in a second, but I just find what I think is, to me, so depressing about Andrew Yang is, and again, because it's so like, look, it was just a novelty one issue run. If there was a guy saying we should have a $1,500 a month UBI for everybody and it will be funded through a wealth tax, I would have zero problems with it.
Yeah.
I have a real problem with the idea of a trade-off. I've talked about the policy stuff, but I realize that the biggest problem that I have when I hear him in interviews is this combination of, this like futuristic language and appeal to possibility with actually just a complete submission.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is like, you know what? If we cannot save democracy, if we can't break up, tech companies or make them public, entities, if we can't, anywhere on the continuum from what I want, which is democratizing the economy, to even just like, the progressive reform of the 21st century. If we can't do any of that, it is true that probably the most humane vision is to like give people who will essentially be redundant $1,000 a month. But wow, that is fucking depressing. Like the idea that you wouldn't have a deeper, broader vision, even for quote unquote normal people, which I do, in fact, and that also you basically say in all of your interviews, like, well, if we have a wealth tax, wealthy people will get around it. Okay. You know, you could be right, but maybe your proposal should be, you know, what's the high-tech futurist solution to turn the IRS from some like depressing bureaucracy that terrorizes lower middle class people into like a global gang of super sleuths that shuts down Cayman Island accounts and exposes corporate and wealthy tax evasion? Like,
Yeah.
that's a vision. It's so deadening, and the complete political ignorance and narcissism of his supporters, which like run the gamut of people I should maybe be nicer to because it's really very sincere, but they just have no understanding of power or politics or economics, to other people where it's clearly just like, fuck you, I want my video game bucks. It's very disheartening, man. That's why I don't give Marianne shit. I mean, I loved what she did with Dave Rubin, but for her, you know, all of her limits, and she's got her limits, but she's trying to at least up tempo people a little bit. This is feeding everybody's.
No,
it's lower common denominator dunce shit.
I got on the Marianne train really early. She's been like my second choice for honestly for a long time. Like, I really do think that she is like a harbinger of a leftist, like, you know, new age spiritual coalition that could be equivalent to evangelicals. I hope.
That sounds amazing.
We can hope.
That sounds amazing. Well, brother, this was great.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed it. Do you want to
a week?
What? I'm sorry.
How many shows do you put out a week?
Oh man, it depends. Like, I will put out at least one video a month, sometimes 2 or 3. It kind of depends. Right now, it's kind of tough because it's the summer and kids are out of school.
Yep.
You know, so it's a little trickier. But hopefully in the fall, I'll get back to making videos and writing. I might have another piece coming out in Current Affairs soon. I'll see. I had one come out a few issues ago.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we'll see. But keep up the good work. Michael Brooks, where can everyone find you? Although if they on my small channel, they've probably seen yours, but tell them anyway.
I loved. I caught you a little bit with Angie.
Oh yeah.
I watched some of that just to prepare for this, and I'm trying to check out more of her work more because I also I like Peter Coffin. But she said you're criminally undersubscribed. So let me just say, if you have come because of me, subscribe to this man's channel. And as for me, if you want to get a flavor of my work, at this point we have a pretty robust Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. Probably, you know, I mean, look, if you become a patron of the show, it's a completely different experience. There's way more content, a lot of really deep dive history I'm really proud of. But I think you do get a pretty deep sense of the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, and you can follow me, you know, @_Michael Brooks on Twitter, and I guess you can find me on Instagram. I don't do that as much, but you can find me, and there's also Instagram and Twitter accounts for the Michael Brooks Show too.
It is so worth it. I'm a patron. I can't even get to like some of the content some weeks. It's crazy. The post games it's worth it.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening, folks. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you really like what I do, please consider becoming a patron. I have some great premium content available for patrons. I have a series on how to take psychedelics safely and sanely that I think people will really enjoy. That's available for patrons at the $5 a month level. That's the Rebel level. Remember, all generalizations are stupid, so never speak in absolutes.